So, Chapter 1, Natural Theology. I would divide this into about 4 different sections. The first one tells us really what natural theology is and makes some opening remarks. The second section, starting around page 10, starts to take us through a history of natural theology and religious thought. He particularly focused on the Hebrew scriptures and then later Christian writing as well. In the third section, around page 15, Polkinghorne starts to pick up the story in the Middle Ages, focusing mostly on Aquinas, his response to Anselm, and a consideration of the traditional arguments for the existence of God, particularly the ontological and cosmological. He moves through there into teleological arguments and talks more specifically about Paley and what he calls the Darwinian debacle and the God of the gaps. So that's what we're expecting in this chapter, largely an historical survey with some comments. Let's start to go through them. So, a scientist of even quite modest attainments will find from time to time that he receives unsolicited contributions from the general public, proposing solutions to the riddle of the physical universe. His correspondents may need a little help with the mathematics or a testimonial to facilitate the publication of their ideas, but they are confident that they have made an important advance. I am sorry to have to say that such items of this character that have come my way have, without exception, proved valueless. Many have not been sufficiently articulate even to attain the status of being wrong, nor does some kinship with science prove any help in the matter. Some of my most persistent and wrong-headed correspondents have been electrical engineers. This thought crosses my mind as I, a theoretical physicist by profession, take up my pen to write on matters theological. To be sure, I received some grounding in theology during my preparation for ordination, and the subject remains among the principal interests which direct my reading. But it is also true that electrical engineers are taught a bit of physics, and no doubt they read more about it after graduation. So how can I have the temerity to attempt the present task? I certainly cannot pretend to write as a professional theologian, but only as a scientist deeply interested in the understanding of religion. I believe that the justification for the enterprise lies in the nature of theology. If it is to lay claim again to its medieval title of the Queen of the Sciences, that will not be because it is in a position to prescribe the answers to the questions discussed by other disciplines. Rather, it will be because it must avail of itself of their answers in the conduct of its own inquiry, thereby setting them within the most profound context available. Theology's regal status lies in its commitment to seek the deepest possible level of understanding. I think that's probably quite an important line. I would probably put a Q in the margins there. And while we're paused, let's just remind ourselves what this means. The Queen of the Sciences. It might seem a bit odd to us because we're used to thinking of the sciences in terms of the natural sciences. But of course, science, from the Latin, just means knowledge. And so it was held to be the queen of branches of knowledge. Theology was. So let's continue. In the course of that endeavour, it needs to take into account all other forms of knowledge, while in no way attempting to assert hegemony over them. A theological view of the world is a total view of the world. Every form of human understanding must make its contribution to it. The offering of the physical sciences to that end must be made, at least partly, by those who work in them. Theology cannot just be left to the theologians, as is made clear by the recent spectacle of a distinguished theologian writing more than 300 pages on God in creation with only an occasional and cursory reference to scientific insight. It is as idle to suppose that one can satisfactorily speak about the doctrine of creation without taking into account the actual nature of the world, as it would be to think that the significance of the world could be exhaustively conveyed in the scientific description of its physical processes. There must be a degree of consonance between the assertions of science and theology if the latter are to make sense. Hence, there is an urgent need for dialogue between the two disciplines. The arena for their interaction is natural theology. Natural theology may be defined as the search for the knowledge of God by the exercise of reason and inspection of the world. Again, let's just pause here. This is his definition. We saw it in the introduction, but it bears repeating. So, again, just highlight that section and learn his definition of it. There are, of course, those who deny the possibility of such knowledge. They are by no means all of an atheist or agnostic persuasion. People of religious belief have sometimes been so impressed by the transcendence or otherness of God that they've asserted that he is only to be encountered in his gracious and specific acts of self-disclosure, or in other words, revelation. He can condescend to us, but we are powerless to reach out to him. The leading proponent of this view in our century has been Karl Barth. Now, let's just pause and look a little bit at who this Karl Barth figure is, or rather was. He was probably the most preeminent theologian of the 20th century, born in 1886 in Switzerland. He spent a lot of time in Germany. In the 1930s, as you will know from history, Hitler tried to require all priests and several academics to pledge their allegiance to him and to the Nazi Party. Now, Barth refused, and he led something of an academic rebellion. He, in fact, drafted something called the Barmen Declaration, which essentially said that the church must be separate from the state, particularly the Nazi state. And the story goes that he was sacked and was unemployed for an entire weekend before going back to Basel in Switzerland and staying there for pretty much the rest of his life. He did travel to America, met with Martin Luther King Jr., and he was featured on the cover of Time magazine. So he is an important figure in the history of theology. He's a Protestant theologian, but a lot of Catholics deeply respect him. His big systematic theology, remember, systematic theology is an attempt to answer essentially all the questions of theology in some sort of order by creating a system, hence systematic. And it sprawls many different volumes, about 6 million words. Sadly, he never finished it. Its story used to be that he would get up in the morning, he'd listen to an hour of Mozart. He was a huge Mozart fan. He'd do the crossword, and then he'd spend the day writing. Now, what makes Barth quite interesting is that he's a contemporary of Rudolf Bultmann, another German-speaking theologian, also Paul Tillich, and some others. And Bultmann in particular had a great desire to demythologize the Bible, to take out, if you like, all the embarrassing supernatural elements. Bultmann famously suggested that the resurrection was not an event in the life of Christ, but only an event in the life of his disciples. And one of Barth's most influential texts, in fact, really what put him on the theological map, so to speak, was his commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans, which he just calls the Epistle to the Romans, first published in 1919. And what is really refreshing about Barth is that he rejected his old teacher, Adolf von Harnack, who was an espouser of this historical critical method. So sort of saying, oh no, what can we really know about this, the actual Jesus of Nazareth who really lived? Oh, probably not very much. And Barth wants to say two things. Firstly, that much of what the Bible contains is supra-historical. It goes far beyond history. But it also actually is historical. So Jesus Christ really did live, was buried, crucified, died, and really did rise again from the dead. But there's also so much more that we can learn from that. So he's associated with something that we call neo-orthodoxy, kind of a new orthodoxy, but taking on all that we've learned throughout the centuries of biblical scholarship. Now, there are traditionally 4 sources of Christian authority that people use when they are trying to work out what is true in terms of Christian theology, or what they ought to do. Scripture sort of speaks to itself, the Bible. This is often also called revealed theology. Revealed because it comes straight from God. So God discloses himself to us through the words of Scripture, obviously mediated through the pens of men and women, although sadly mostly men for obvious historical reasons. Reason is of kind of what it says. It's applying our reason to work out things about God. Now this might be a priori, very often it's a posteriori. So all the arguments for the existence of God are just that they're trying to use reason to work out stuff about God. Tradition is essentially the church, historical church, passing down wisdom, insights, etc. to the oncoming generation. And you'll find that in the Catholic sort of tradition, or the Catholic faith, not to use the same word there, tradition is particularly important, especially, of course, you have the apostolic succession. So it traces the Pope spiritually back to Peter. And experience, this might be personal experience, it might be sort of wider experience, experience, again, of the church, of individuals in the church, etc. And by balancing those we gain greater understanding of God. But each theologian and each sort of school, if you like, or each church perhaps, will find itself sort of leaning towards one or the other. So reason and tradition are quite important in Catholicism. Scripture is more of a, I suppose, a Lutheran idea. Remember his cry, sola scriptura, only Scripture. And here, what we're going to see Polkinghorne discuss is this tension, if you like, between those who insist that we should really focus on what God says himself in terms of revelation through Scripture, to deduce or induce stuff about God, and those who think, well, we can use our reason to work out stuff. And this whole thing is a little bit like Plato's analogy of the cave, actually. And we might go into that a bit more, but it's this idea of like trying to ascend would be our reason trying to get us out of the cave, versus the person who has to actually come and drag us out of the cave, which might be revelation. So that's a bit of background to Karl Barth, and might explain this next passage here. So Polkinghorne now quotes Barth, who says, "He," and of course this is God, "cannot be known by the powers of human knowledge, but is apprehensible and apprehended solely because of his own freedom, decision and action. What man can know by his own power, according to the measure of his natural powers, his understanding, his feeling, will be at most something like a supreme being, an absolute nature, the idea of an utterly free power, of a being towering over everything. This absolute and supreme being, the ultimate and most profound, this thing itself, has nothing to do with God." And what I suggest you do is to make another note to yourself here, to compare this to the idea that we looked at in the first video, that every image of God is ultimately an idol. And again, how can we, who are finite, really comprehend the infinite? So just also to note here, Barth's love of the concept of the freedom of God. For Barth, God is wholly other. He isn't us. He is the only being that is entirely free because he doesn't depend on anything. And his whole kind of doctrine of salvation is also based on this concept of freedom. One of my lecturers, a chap called Professor David Ford, used to say that you could summarise Barth's position by the words, "Let God be God." So that's a sort of very surfacey sort of interpretation of Barth, but I think it's sound. Let's now move on with the text. So Barth, as you remember, is saying that we can't really know anything, that nothing can be known of God from essentially our own intellects. That nothing seems like something of an overstatement. We can acknowledge that natural theology, whose source of insight is by definition limited to the generalities of experience, will not tell us all about God that is humanly accessible. The individual encounter with him, both of our own and that of the spiritual masters preserved in the tradition, will surely be of the highest importance. Yet, the world is not just a neutral theatre in which these individual revelatory acts take place. Rather, it is itself, if theism is true, the creation of God, and so potentially a vehicle also for his self-disclosure. God is to be found in the general as well as the particular. And here I would again make a big sort of note of that quotation. He is very keen on this idea. It's another of our binary oppositions, so I'll talk about those in more detail later. But essentially, a binary opposition is exactly what it says it is. Two things, an A and a B, that seem completely diametrically opposed. So the general, in particular, as a binary opposition. And what Polkinghorne does throughout this text is he presents these things that seem so opposed and shows us that actually they complement each other. We're going to return to this idea of the general in particular in chapter 2, so do remember it. He's going to talk about how the general are things like laws that govern the universe, and the particular will be an instance, and we're going to talk about the difference between facts and theory and experiments and how they fit into it. So an important point there. But what's he saying here? Essentially then that we can know stuff about God because the world itself is, if you like, a stage, a theatre, and is a vehicle for God's self-disclosure. So the world itself reveals God. So it isn't just about reason. Natural theology includes a revelatory sort of aspect to it. Moving on. Natural theology may only be able to help us to discern something like a supreme being and absolute nature, and it is certainly powerless by itself to bring us to know the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. But its insights are, by the way, I'm just making a reference here, refer to page 103, he's going to come back to this idea later. But his insights are not for that reason to be despised. There's a great deal more to the structure of matter than chemistry can tell us with its talk of 92 elements, but it would be foolish to refuse its assistance in an inquiry into what the physical world is made of. Similarly, natural theology can provide valuable help in an inquiry about whether the process of the world is the carrier of significance and the expression of purpose. This role is of special relevance today, when so many people find it difficult to see theism as a credible and coherent possibility. Natural theology may be for them a necessary starting point. I agree with Hugh Montefiore when he writes about the relationship of the intellectual quest for God through natural theology to the personal commitment of faith, that while it is true that the cold intellectual thinking can never bring anyone into a warm personal relationship with God, it is also true that, while a subjective commitment to God may be satisfying to the self, it lacks credibility to others unless it can be shown that there are good reasons for the actual existence of God to whom commitment has been given. And here I would just rule off the end of section 1 and start with section 2. So this second section of the text begins. The contention that natural theology is important is supported by a consideration of the history of religious thought. I shall attempt a survey to show that it has had a continuing role within the Judeo-Christian tradition. At first sight, no one could seem to be less concerned with such matters than ancient Israel. Belief that there is a God is absolutely axiomatic in the Old Testament, as it is in the New Testament. There is no attempt to reason the matter, no apologetic argument for God's existence. The priests proclaim that he is known in the worship he has ordained and the laws that he has promulgated. The prophets declare him to be found in his saving and judgmental acts in history. Yet, even in Israel, there were those who also sought him in the everyday circumstances of life, or who at least tried to make sense of humdrum experience in the light of their faith in Yahweh. The fruit of their labour is recorded for us in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament and Apocrypha. One of its characteristic forms of expression is the proverb, a short sort of refinement of the folk adage. By this means the wise men sought to discern an order in the chaotic flux of events. Von Rad said that the teachers of wisdom stood in the forward line of experiential knowledge. So we should probably just highlight Von Rad. He's going to come back to him. And let's just very quickly pause here to explain that wisdom literature, is quite literally literature in the Bible that is concerned with imparting or discussing wisdom. Wisdom is often personified in more sort of mythic texts, I suppose you might say. So, let's carry on. Their observation is often deadpan, without overt moralising. A poor man is odious even to his friend. The rich have friends in plenty. They are men of patient observation, rather than charismatic enlightenment, so a certain calm level-headedness attracts their praise. Experience uses few words. Discernment keeps a cool head. One feels that they would thoroughly approve of the motto of the Royal Society, nullius in verba, freely translated, no mere talking. An anchorage in the ways things are, acting as a restraint on a speculative fancy, is of particular importance for theology. One is sometimes astonished at the confidence with which the fathers, or the medieval theologians, by the way, here he means the church fathers, so you might just want to put a little addition there. He means the church fathers. By church fathers we mean people like Augustine, sort of quite early thinkers, Origen, and many others. Or the medieval theologians, he's going to get onto them, will discuss such ineffable subjects as the nature of angels or the inner life of the Holy Trinity. The wise men encourage this asking of the question instinctive to the scientist, how do you know? They look at the world with an openness to the hard facts of its reality and resist the temptation endemic in religious thought to confine themselves to the way they would like things to be, or hope that things will eventually come to be. Yet, in pursuit of knowledge, the wise men were willing to recognise their own limitations as part of what actually is the case. Von Rad says that they were aware that the area a man can grasp with his rational powers and tell out with his being is really small. Rational exploration did not decoy them into rational overconfidence. Face to face with the Lord, wisdom, understanding, counsel go for nothing. And I think this is nice and humble, and it's become perhaps this narrative of our time that certainly I think you're probably taught in the schoolroom that science is this great, big, powerful tour de force of epistemological understanding, that actually it has great explanatory power, but really when you think about it, what we know amounts to very, very little. And this is a great big theme. Remember Socrates as well. All I know is that I know nothing. It might even be worth making a bit of a note of that. So, cf. Socrates. Let's continue then. Since the wisdom writer's special concern is with knowledge of God derived from the general rather than the particular experience, there is a universal character to their thought. The founding father of the tradition was said to be Solomon, and one can readily imagine such a warily appraising attitude arising in the cosmopolitan brilliance of his court. Solomon, as you remember, was son of King David via Bathsheba. We might talk about that later. He is compared with the wise men from the East and from Egypt, admittedly to his advantage, but in terms that suggest that like is being set beside like, a comparison with other nations unthinkable for Israel in the spheres of priest or prophet. So why is that? Just think about that for a moment. Obviously, we can compare the idea of wisdom. Many people might be wise with or without a revelation. So wisdom isn't dependent on revelation. I think that's quite an important point. And in that way, of course, it's totally different from the insights that a prophet has. Because a prophet is, of course, hearing what God says. So that is, and then communicating it to the people. So a prophet speaks from God and necessarily requires revelation, whereas wisdom draws on maybe our experience and knowledge. In Harris Westminster terms, I suppose it's a bit like the purpose. And so it doesn't necessarily rely on God. Whereas the other peoples, according to the Jewish tradition in the ancient Near East, were of course heretics and heathen pagans. So they're spouting lies as far as the Old Testament is concerned. Prophets and priests. Okay. Three. Part of the book of Proverbs is a transcription from the Egyptian writings of Amenemope. There is an... Let me do that again. Part of the book of Proverbs is a transcription from the Egyptian writings of Amenemope. There is an accessible character to natural theology that helps it to cross cultic frontiers. Nevertheless, in the end, it must seek its integration with the totality of the experience of God and thought about Him. Just an aside there, just note what he's doing here. He's sort of talking. He's doing basically some literary or source criticism of the Bible there. You'll see other people do that as well, like Hick, for example. Okay, continuing. The later wisdom... Take 5. The later wisdom writings are set in a more explicitly Yahwehistic context than their predecessors. As part of the wise men's cool observation of the world, there was regard for what we would call nature, a concept itself unknown to the Hebrew. Thus, at the end of the book of Job, God's answer to the complaint of the innocent sufferer is a catalogue of the wonders of the physical world, and an injunction to consider the hippopotamus and the crocodile, albeit exalted to mythic proportions. They are reminders to Job that the Lord has other concerns beyond those with men. Behold, behemoth, which I have made as I have made you. That line, I think, is important. We'll return to consider whether you find Polkinghorne to anthropocentric. I think that you'd probably have to agree that he isn't, because his concern is the whole universe. It's a theme to which we'll return when we have a little look at Tennant in a short while. But I also thought that this line here, the Lord has other concerns beyond those with men, it reminded me of a line in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, where he says that Aslan has other countries to attend to. As you remember, that the children are a bit sad that Aslan has gone off, and it's at the end of the book, and where's he going? Doesn't he care about us? And I think it's one of the beavers that says that you must realise Aslan has other countries to attend to. So let's carry on. It is characteristic of natural theology that it delivers us from a narrow anthropocentricity. That's a really nice line there, I think. Take 5. It is characteristic of natural theology that it delivers us from a narrow anthropocentricity. That is a nice little line, I think, to make a note of. Moltmann is surely right to say no theological doctrine of creation must be allowed to reduce the understanding of belief in creation to the existential self-understanding of the person. If God is not creator of the world, he cannot be my creator either. At a humble level, the enumeration saying in Proverbs such as 3 things are too wonderful to me, 4 I do not understand, the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a maiden, show a concern with the physical world at the level of natural history. The encyclopedic collection of for instances. The Hebrews were unable to proceed beyond this, to develop a scientific point of view concerned with the pattern of cause and effect. They lacked the necessary concepts. In particular, despite experience of exile in Babylon, an ancient centre of some degree of sophistication in calculation and astronomy, they made no progress with mathematics. Nevertheless, the post-exilic wisdom writers did take one remarkable step. Let's just very quickly make sure that you understand what he's saying here. He's using a lot of what might seem to be jargon. So, as you remember, potted history of Israel. In fact, let me just pause here to explain this, because if you don't know your Bible, and so you might get a little bit confused. So what we do is we start with, of course, Adam and all the rest of it, and then Noah and the flood, etc., etc. Then, of course, you have Abraham. Abraham is the first Jew. His name is changed from Abraham, and he has his son Isaac. And Isaac begets Jacob, and Jacob is called Israel after he wrestles with the angel of the Lord. Sort of means one who wrestles with God. And he has 12 sons, which become the tribes of Israel. Now, you remember the story, hopefully, of Joseph and his technicoloured dream coat, and how his brothers sell him into slavery because they're a little bit annoyed. He is pretty annoying. I mean, basically, he keeps saying, "Oh, yeah, I had this dream, and in my dream, you were bowing down to me." He's the 11th son, and you remember, obviously, that Reuben, as the eldest, would inherit the lot, and there are complicated reasons for him being a favourite son. Basically, it's because poor old Jacob was tricked into marrying the sister of the woman that he actually loved. He actually laboured 7 years for Rachel, whom he loved, did a deal with her father, and after 7 years he was going to marry who he thought was Rachel, but when he took the veil off, he discovered it was her somewhat ugly sister Leah. So he then said, "Oh, okay, well, that's done now, but also give me your other daughter, and then I'll work another 7 years for you." And most of his sons were through Leah or Leah's handmaid, but Joseph was his firstborn from the woman that he really loved. So that's sort of why he's a favourite son. But nevertheless, doesn't excuse Joseph's arrogance and annoyingness. So his brothers sell him into slavery. He ends up in Potiphar's household, and then there's some incident where some sexual harassment. Basically, he's innocent, and he's in jail, and he interprets some chap's dream, and later he interprets the Pharaoh's dream, and correctly predicts that there'll be a famine in the land of Egypt after 7 years, and so of sort of bumper growth. The Pharaoh is very pleased. He puts him in charge. Basically, he makes him Chancellor of the Exchequer, and eventually his brothers come to Egypt for grain from the land of Canaan, and then so he is in Egypt from Canaan, and then sort of after this, because the Pharaoh is all very pleased, he invites Joseph's whole family to settle there, and about 70 people settle there. Then some years pass, and several hundred years pass, in fact. New Pharaoh comes, he forgets this sort of arrangement with Joseph. He enslaves the Hebrews, as you remember, and they are slaves for many years, and then eventually he thinks, well, look, all the Hebrew slaves are going to overrun us, so we must kill all the not even firstborn, sorry, we must kill all the male sons of the Israelites. And then, as you remember, Moses is put into a basket and successfully sailed down the Nile, taken in by the Pharaoh's daughter, raised as an Egyptian. Do watch The Prince of Egypt for that story. And then, of course, you have the exile and the Exodus and the flight from Egypt. And actually what happens is they end up returning back to Canaan, because Canaan was the so-called the promised land. It was the land that was promised as an inheritance to Abraham and his seed and his descendants forever in perpetuity. This is, of course, where we get the modern-day Israeli-Palestine conflict. It comes in part out of that, although, of course, it's also part of modern politics. So they go back to Canaan. Of course, it's inhabited by all kinds of people: the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites, the Ammonites, and some Girgashites and some other sort of characters. And they basically just wipe them out. A bit of mild genocide there, but it is dictated to, it's commanded by God, so, divine command theory, that's fine. You might discuss that at some later juncture. So they inhabit this land of Canaan, the promised land, also, of course, it basically, aka modern Israel. Actually, modern Israel doesn't even cover half of what it actually was, but it's the land of Israel. So you can see where it used to be and where it sort of is now. So they return to this land, and when they get there, the question is, who's going to govern us, right? well, who's going to govern us? Maybe a king. And at this point, God has put some people in charge. So after Moses comes, not his son, but his spiritual successor, Joshua, son of Nun. And he's the one that really leads them into the promised land. I think I'm gonna have to clear that. So after they enter the land of Canaan, and they essentially have these judges that are set up, but they don't like the idea of judges. They want to be like all the other nations. And at this point, there's this chap called Samuel who's a prophet, and he says, "No, look. To be honest, guys, you don't want a king. If you have a king, what's going to happen is he's going to tax you. He's going to spend all that money on himself, on throwing parties. You're not going to like it. It's going to be bad." And like, no, we want to be king. We want to be like all the other nations. It's like, I really don't recommend it. Well, you want a king? No, okay. So then he asks God who should be the king, and God picks this chap called Saul as the first king, and it starts off well, but then he becomes corrupt. So then he's sort of axed, and we have David who writes the Psalms, and they are famous for killing, of course, Goliath with a sling and some stones. Goliath, the giant. David is described as a man after God's own heart, which is an amazing description of him, even though he does some really bad things. The worst thing that he does is he basically forces his woman to sleep with him, Bathsheba, who's married to another chap. He sees her bathing on the roof, as the Leonard Cohen song says, and he basically takes her into the royal household, sleeps with her, then kind of thinks, oh shoot, what happens if she gets pregnant? I know, I'll call her husband Uriah back from the war and say, have some nice time with your wife. So that's what he does. Uriah comes back, but actually he decides not to go home to see his wife because he feels guilty with his men still out there, fighting the war. And David says, why didn't you go home? You should go home, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And Uriah's like, well, no, I can't. And he says, no, I tell you, go home, see your wife, and that'd be great. He doesn't. So now he's got this problem, David. So what he does is he writes to his other general and tells him to put Uriah in the front line. Uriah is therefore killed, and then he's free to marry Bathsheba. Well, he does get punished for this, and actually she was pregnant and their child dies. But then they have another child, Solomon. Solomon is the chap who, when God asks him, ask one thing of me, what will you have? And Solomon asks for wisdom rather than gold. And God says, yeah, great choice, you will be wise. Because you chose wisdom, you'll also get some money. And again, things go pretty well for Solomon at first, and then there's a bit of mild corruption. And after a couple of generations, the kingdoms are split. The kingdoms in the north call themselves of Israel, and the kingdoms in the south, the tribes in the south, call themselves Judah. Now, what happens is, over the course of time, there's wars with other nations. Those 10 tribes are eventually lost. And then other ones are taken into exile to Babylon. Before this, Solomon has built, of course, the first temple, hence Solomon's temple. And that gets destroyed. And they're in exile for many years, many generations. Then they return, they're allowed to return, and they rebuild the temple. So this is this post-exilic, literally after the exile. And then there's other bits of exiles, and they come back, and then there's this sort of period. And then, of course, eventually, when you fast forward several hundred years, you get the Roman occupation and the time of Jesus. So that is, with apologies for being so brief, but that's a very quick backstory to what's going on in the Old Testament in terms of its politics and the sort of timeline there. That's why we call after this exile, they rebuilt the temple, literally the second temple. So we talk about Second Temple Judaism being after this period. So when you're reading through Polkinghorne, and of course when you're reading through other theologians who are writing about stuff, and they're mentioning these stories, or they're referring to these parts of Jewish history, that's sort of the backstory, if you don't have time to read it all and piece it together. So now we can actually return to our text, and that just explains again that what he means by the post-exilic writers did take one remarkable step. He says, they personified wisdom. So this is the important thing. So they made essentially wisdom into a person, speaking of her as the beginning of God's works, antedating the material world. Now, I wonder if there is some influence here of Plato, because in the forms in Plato are, of course, existing previously. Now, they may be sort of eternal, but later Jewish later Christian Platonists would suggest that wisdom and these things are the first bits of creation, and they are in a way the first thing that God makes, therefore being superior to other things but being universal. So essentially making Plato's forms part of God's creation, but the first parts of his creation. But yeah, if you read lots of this literature that personifies wisdom, you'll see where ideas about a sort of figure perhaps being involved with God in creation comes about. His agent in creation and his consort in its enjoyment. This astonishing figure is a challenge to exegetes, as in those who try and interpret the Bible. Von Wad says that the wisdom imagery shows that God had at his service a quite different means besides prophets and priests whereby he could reach men, namely the voice of primeval order. Thus it was that natural theology found voice in the Old Testament. Now, wisdom is one of the many concepts which constellate round the Logos, the Word, so powerfully proclaimed as being in the beginning with God and equal to God in the prologue of John's Gospel. And we should pause again just to have a look at John's Gospel. As you remember, it starts off with this wonderful line: in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now you remember that the beginning of the Old Testament is in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth, or when God was creating the heavens and the earth. So here we have it in English. In Greek, en arche hein holokos, kai holokos hein proston theon, kai theos hein hologos. So this is this concept of the word, but it goes back to older pre-Jewish sources. And then he was in the beginning with God. All things came into being with him, and through him was not thing that came into being what has come into being. So this is now quite radical in John's Gospel, because this word that creates isn't itself created. It is, in fact, God. The Word was with God. The Word was God as part of that creative force. And then, of course, you remember that what's really astonishing for John is that this Word becomes flesh and lived among us. So the incarnation here, kai hologos, there's that word again, you see. Sarx egento, became flesh, and es kenosen, ein humin. And that kind of dwelt among us is more like the past tense of pitching a tent, or tabernacled among us, which is particularly interesting. But we should return to Polkinghorne or we'll never get to it. So, we will come again here. So just make a note to yourself. Here, John's Gospel, as in John 1, 1 to, let's say, 14 probably. Okay. Ideas come together here which are both Greek and Hebrew in origin. The Stoic notion of the Logos is concerned with the rational order of the world, while the Hebrew dabar, which means both word and deed, focuses on activity. That word of the Lord by which the heavens were made, and which came to the prophets as the message of God's purpose at work in history. So just remember that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, etc. God speaks the world into being, so that for this Hebrew concept of word goes beyond just the rational process. It is a doing as well as a sort of a being or a thing. Okay, now the twin discernment of both pattern and process. Here we have yet another set of binary oppositions, pattern and process, in the workings of the world, of being and becoming, lies at the heart of any attempt to construct a natural theology in true accord with the way things are. There has been a perpetual temptation in religious thought to concentrate on one pole or the other of this dialectic, the static perfection of the God of the philosophers in all his remoteness versus the living God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in all his dangerous anthropomorphism. A true account will hold the two in balance. It's interesting that a similar complementarity of being and becoming is necessary in the scientific story of the world, as we shall see in chapter 3. Right, that is, I would say, the important thing to note from this whole sort of mini section so far. It sets up his theme here, as you see. A true account will hold the two in balance. So this is his idea all along of complementarity, okay? Things that seem opposite actually go hand in glove. They complement each other, even though they seem to be diametrically opposed. And so you've got this God of the philosophers versus the God of Abraham. Think back here to comparing the prime mover of Aristotle to the God of Abraham. The God of Aristotle isn't really a god, it just is something that explains how the world moves, right? That it moves towards itself. Even Plato's sort of God and these other things, they're quite remote. They don't get involved in the same way that the God of Abraham does. It says it all, doesn't it? The God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. You remember that, and have a look at this again. Look at Exodus 3:14, which is the story of the burning bush, when Moses encounters God in the burning bush, and he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." This idea of God being particular as well as general is exactly what Polkinghorne wants to explore with us. That God, as you remember from before, God is to be found in the general and the particular. I think this is such an important point. Let's make it really clear here. So God elects individuals, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This shows that he is particular, but he is also general. Found in the general, in the laws of nature, the way that he governs us, etc. So there's this tension, if you like, running throughout Polkinghorne's concept of God, and on the one hand, yes, he wants us to see the great cosmic architect of the universe, what he calls the author and producer of the whole play elsewhere in chapter 4. But at the same time, there's this very deeply personal God. So very personal. And that is what makes him very different from the gods of the philosophers, who don't really perhaps care. They're quite remote. Do update your notes accordingly there. And now let's return. So before John's prologue is complete, he's moved from the generalities of form to the particularity of expressions. There we've got this same idea again, right? General to the particular. Also, by the way, you should have made a note of this idea if his dangerous anthropomorphism goes back to that notion we thought about in looking forward to chapter 6, but it started the text off by sort of talking about the limitations of us and our language. So, going back to John's Gospel that we discussed earlier, there you have it again, just to remind you of it. And he says this quintessential Christian assertion that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The epistle to the Colossians declares of the Christ so made known that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Such consistency as we may find in the coherence of the world will never lend itself to the cosmic Christ of Colossians. So this is this verse from Colossians here. Let's just have a quick look at it. The Son, as in Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Don't be confused with firstborn. He doesn't mean as temporally. Obviously Christ is not created in that way. But this is this cosmic Christ. He says, but that cosmic Christ would not be believable if the universe were at root a chaos rather than a cosmos. And just to remind you of those terms, basically they're opposites, right? So chaos is simply something which is disordered, whereas chaos is disorder. I mean, you know what that word means. But the cosmos is the Greek term, and it means an ordered universe. So that's really key. Okay. So there must be a congruence between the claims of revelation and the perceptions of a rational inquiry into the world. That necessity alone is sufficient to make natural theology an indispensable part of the theological endeavour. The urban Christians who wrote the New Testament showed less concern with the natural world than do the writers of the Old Testament, whose style of life made them more in touch with nature. Of course, they were mostly nomadic, perhaps, or farmers and agriculturalists, whereas by the time we get to Christianity 2,000 years ago, things have developed more metropolitanly, along more metropolitan lines, I should say. The New Testament writers are so seized by the thought of God's great act in Christ by which they've been encountered that the generalities of human experience play only a small part in their thought. Nevertheless, it is Paul whose words provide the classic text to which natural theologians are wont to appeal in search of scriptural warrant for their activities. Writing to the Romans, he held that no man can excuse himself on the grounds that he did not know there is a God, for, ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. Okay, so that's a good line to quote there from St. Paul. We might feel that the clarity of the case is somewhat exaggerated by Paul, but his words certainly encourage the attempt to pursue natural theology. God is the elusive hidden one, not overpowering us by his unveiled presence, but it would surely be disconcerting if there were no signs of him to be found in his creation. The Greek fathers of the Church made use of the idea of the Logos, particularly in the 2nd century, as the answer to the problem of how God could be both a changeless, self-contained being and, at the same time, the active created God. Their concern was with the dialectic of being and becoming, but concentrating on the question of how God is related to the world in a descending movement, opposite to the ascending flow of natural theology, seeking to move from the world to God. As the Fathers continued their wrestling with the mysteries of the Incarnation and the Holy Trinity, in an effort to do justice to the particular experiences of revelation, the Logos faded out as a useful category of thought. In the Western Church, Augustine's great influence milited against the exercise of reason and the inspection of the world as routes to God. He wrote, "Understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, do not seek in order to believe, but believe in order that you may understand." The one-sided emphasis is ironic in one who was the greatest intellect that the Latin Church produced, and whose powers of introspection into the polarities of the human psyche provided him with the basis for the most penetrating discussion yet written concerning the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. The link between belief and understanding is another set of binaries for us to consider here, is a root concern of this essay. They cohere in mutual interaction with which requires a balance in which neither is afforded an overriding primacy. The dialogue between them is analogous to that between theory and experiment in science. Important point here. Without the insight of theory, experiment would have no significance. The behaviours and registrations of laboratory apparatus are not of interest in themselves, but only for what they are understood to signify. In a similar way, an act of faith, a commitment to some belief, is necessary in the search for wider understanding. On the other hand, no theory can survive which does not find some confirmation in experiment. A physical idea, however intrinsically beautiful, will only remain of interest if it proves capable of illuminating physical fact. In a similar way, faith is not unmotivated. It must be congruent with the way things are and corrigible by them. Corrigible means, changeable. There's an analogy between this dialectic of faith and understanding and the interrelationship of divine grace and human response in the life of the Spirit, another balance that Augustine did not succeed in maintaining. So just note here, we've got again these two more binary oppositions here, haven't we? We've got belief and understanding, and I think you should possibly compare this to the divided line. And as you remember, in the divided line, Plato puts pistis, or rather belief, rather low down, doesn't he, than understanding, or we might say reason. But here, I think Polkinghorne is saying that there are two different things, and we mustn't put one over the other. And he's saying that this is just analogous to how theory and experiment work. So again, experiment, we might produce an experiment, we might drop objects and see if they fall, and we find that they keep falling, and so this helps us devise a theory of gravity. Actually, he's going to talk about that at the beginning of chapter 2. But what he points out is that you can't just have a random theory. You can't have theory without showing how it interacts with common experience. Otherwise, it won't really be talking about the real world. But similarly, if you just have experiments and don't develop any theory, sort of what's the point? So this is a big idea, and it kind of points here towards chapter 2. Points to chapter 2. Okay. That, I would say, takes us to essentially the end of section 2, and then we'll have section 3 to follow.